watching the Star TV network.
The British company Pearson was out there expanding its horizons, and at the time were part owners of less than a quarter of Sky and 12% of Yorkshire Tyne Tees, and they were about to buy the post-ITV franchise Thames, by then a production company. They were keen on expanding their media interests outside of Europe, and Star fitted the bill nicely. Unfortunately, their demands were ridiculously optimistic. 66% to two-thirds of the economic share of the company, much to the dismay of the Hong Kong businesses. So Pearson never made it, and within a matter of weeks, a saviour was found. And that saviour was none other than Satan, Rupert Murdoch.
Aqui é a média antes. Por meio desta fita, estamos dando nosso último aviso. Abram o olho e percebam o que está acontecendo. Ou senão, será tarde demais. Aqui é a média Atlantis.
He was already the owner of the Hong Kong newspaper South China Morning Post. He sold off to mainland Chinese e-commerce tycoon Jack Ma a few years ago, and his initial plan for conquering Asia was to buy 22% of TVB. But the Hong Kong regulatory hurdles made it impossible. So he took over Star instead and essentially gave it the Sky treatment.
卫星电视横跨亚洲53个国家，走在世界娱乐的尖端。您现在收看的是卫星电视中文台。
Its branding gained a new, glassier approach, developed by the omnipotent Novocom, and with music likely from Frank Gehry, the same team behind the on-screen identities of sister operations Sky. Interesting thought, if you're watching this from Singapore, the Novocom Gehry team developed the same brand identities for the entire Singaporean terrestrial TV landscape in 1994. Incidentally, he hired Sam Chisholm as the director of programming. Basically 3 of the 5 channels got revamps. MTV was just piggybacked off Viacom, and the BBC was just the BBC. The biggest ace was in their new owners, as along with Murdoch came its entire film and television catalogue. Star Plus soon looked like nothing so much as an Asian Sky One, introducing many Asian viewers to shows like The Simpsons, The X-Files, and Friends later on, even though Friends never was on Sky One in the UK. They even took these solemn voiced channel announcements from Sky, as in, "This is Star, and you're watching this channel," a practice that was likely reverted from its cousin Sky. I mean, the roles were reverted.
This is the Star TV network, and you're watching Star Plus.
Soon everybody else was doing it, from Singapore Television 12 to ZTV.
This is Premier 12. Part of the Singapore Television 12 network.
ये है Z Network। और आप देख रहे हैं ZTV।
আপনারা দেখছেন RTV নেটওয়ার্কে বাংলা চ্যানেল সোনালী।
Things ran normally until 1994, when the BBC made a documentary called Chairman Mao, The Last Emperor, that aired on the Time Watch strand on BBC Two in the UK at first. It was heavily critical of Beijing's regime, and what was worse, it alleged sexual misconduct on the part of Mao Zedong himself. The party inevitably responded by cutting the BBC from Star's service. For context, let's rewind to how Chinese television was before Star came along. The average viewer in the People's Republic picked up about 5 to 8 channels. There were the main 3 from the state broadcaster CCTV, and then a handful of local channels run at arm's length from provincial or city government. Around that time, television commercials had been allowed for 15 years. Star TV entered the Chinese market shortly after Murdoch's takeover and gave the Chinese a massive turnaround, with the channels also having Chinese audio, but as I said, such free and uncontrolled broadcasting was a massive headache for the Chinese government, especially with the Communist Party's policy of Stonewall denialism. Rupert Murdoch said the following when he started broadcasting his network to China in a formal way, mere months before the BBC fell foul.
Advances in the technology of telecommunications have proved an unambiguous threat to totalitarian regimes everywhere. Fax machines enable dissidents to bypass state-controlled print media. Direct dial telephony makes it difficult for a state to control personal conversations. And satellite broadcasting makes it possible for information-hungry residents of many closed societies to bypass state-controlled television channels.
This speech was also broadcast on one of Star's channels and kicked up such a storm that Murdoch's dreams of the so-called satellite bypass practically ended before they began, even though by the time of the speech, China had become Star's largest market. In fact, many years later, the Chinese government tightened their restrictions on foreigners and dissidents, buying into any kind of television channel or media outlet in mainland China. Remember what I said about Malaysia earlier on, opting out of Star in order to keep control of the message? Different countries have different standards and practices, and China's communist neighbors to the south in Vietnam followed China's lead, although to a lesser extent. In more recent times, they loosened up loads of regulations and allowed imported content from the West to circulate. Central Asia's Turkic nations, despite the distance from Turkey in the cultural and linguistic fields, thought that broadcasts from Turkey were harming their reputation. Singapore always said no to satellite dishes, simply because of how good they are at being a small country of many ethnicities. The success is based on tightly controlling a very delicate balance, and it was felt that unregulated satellite television full of undesirable content like sex, pornography, violence, you name it, would upset it. Malaysia said no for similar reasons, adding manipulation of the news to the mix, so much that the Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad was openly critical of the Western media giants entering their doors as if they were aliens. As he put it at the time, why has Mr. Rupert Murdoch bought a 64% stake of Star TV for $500 million? If he's not going to control the news that we are going to receive, then what is it? Despite Murdoch's claims that the television beamed by satellite didn't have to follow the laws of any single country, the opposition stance of no to strangers often won out. Less strict regimes already had a television service that was controlled in some way by the government. TV3 Malaysia was being run by a company named International Resources that was until divested in the early 2000s. All Singaporean TV was led by a shell company of the government. Thailand didn't allow total independent control of over-the-air terrestrial channels, although that stopped when analog signals switched off in 2018. Bangladesh got stuck with a one-channel terrestrial monopoly, and so on. Of course, cable TV was still a loophole, but a loophole that required region-wide content revision, so that everyone would be pleased with the end result. Both Star and the competing companies in the crowded Pan-Asian television market had to accept strict censorship practices. To give you an example, all movies shown on their channels were down to airline levels. Star filled the gap left by the BBC with a movie channel, or two, Star Chinese movies for the North and Star movies for the South. wasn't just the BBC who fell off the perch. MTV eventually got bored piggybacking off Star due to complications with its licensing and figured out that the only way to continue a viable operation in Asia was by letting Viacom launch its own flavor of MTV, this time broadcasting from Singapore instead of Hong Kong. There's two channels, first MTV China, which incidentally shut down early this year, and the second coming of MTV Asia. To fill in this gap, on the 1st of May 1994, Murdoch created Channel V, which was basically a more localized answer to MTV. Murdoch was probably quite fond of it. That he even launched an Australian version on Foxtel after buying in a handful of channels from XYZ, the company behind much of the in-house channels Galaxy had.
Channel B. Unlike anything you've ever seen.
Jabba discussed occupational hazards with the Foo Fighters.
What do you think is the biggest risk in your occupation? Becoming an asshole?
Star TV service still had one potentially fatal problem. Even before Murdoch took over, Star TV broadcast its services free-to-air to all of Asia, and under this system, they thought that the revenue would only come from its advertisers. Money doesn't grow on trees, and even if the advertiser slots bought out to a massive Asian audience, there was a huge shortfall. And then there are those censorship issues I just mentioned, or in this case, lack thereof, in an initial phase. In contrast to a normal Asian television station, most shows on Star were uncut, and in many cases quite scandalous in certain cultures. Santa Barbara, for example, had an incest storyline, something many conservative Asian societies were forbidden to screen.
Well, I like the soap operas and the different variety of programs that they show on Star Plus. It's quite entertaining. I like Santa Barbara. I have a lot of friends, and evenings we meet down, we discuss our soap operas, and we try to predict what the next days would be, what would happen next in Santa Barbara. I think that in Santa Barbara we see a part of American way of life which is more free. Indians are very narrow-minded. They would not want to be demonstrative and, show their true feelings out in society. Whereas the Western culture, the Western way of living is more free.
Star TV Standards and Practices Department would have its job likely curtailed by a number of conservative or less conservative media clerics in the Middle East, who are figuring out a way to start a pan-Arabian method of censorship by letting companies set up satellite operators in more liberal-ish countries, relatively speaking, like Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, in order to prevent the more conservative Saudi watchdogs. The alternatives to Star were ART, Orbit, and Showtime. Later, Star would join in on the entire bandwagon. Side note, at the time of recording, some pan-Arabian news channels are moving from the UAE to Saudi Arabia at the prince's request. Oh, and by the way, all those satellite operators were the reason why Channel 3, owned by Aramco, was no longer a viable option. Good luck for Showtime Arabia.